Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots. I'm Katie Helper.
I'm Mary Matte. Thanks so much for being here. Our website is usefulidiots.podcast.com. Go there to support the show and get bonus content. This week, we are speaking to Mohammed Shahada. He is a political analyst and writer from Gaza, an essential source to follow Israel's mass murder campaign. We've relied on him so much. He's been on the show a few times now, and he's back to discuss all the latest in the horror show that continues to unfold, including talk of a potential ceasefire and this new fake Israeli U.S. so-called aid group that was established to basically advance Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign in the name of delivering aid. And it's so cynical, it's so evil, and we break it all down in today's episode.
Really repulsive stuff, but we're so glad that people like Mohammed are here to shed light on what's happening. And he's such an invaluable voice. But before that amazing interview, let's get to our 4 basic food groups. What do we got for Democrat suck, Aaron?
For Democrat suck, let's touch base with Democrats on foreign policy and what they're saying. The Trump administration is warmongering. It's fueling Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza. It's talking to Iran about a new deal, but it doesn't seem to have decided what it wants to do. It changes its mind constantly. And of course, the proxy war in Ukraine, Trump has not fulfilled his promise to end that conflict. Remember, he said he was going to do it within 24 hours. Not happening. But what are Democrats saying? Are they coming up with fresh critiques? Are they advocating peace? Are they advocating diplomacy? No, they're sticking to the exact same script that basically Joe Biden had. Joe Biden, who we all know now was in serious cognitive decline. That's basically the foreign policy that Democrats continue to embrace, one that was in serious cognitive decline. So here is Hakeem Jeffries talking about this talk from the Trump administration of brokering peace in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is a sworn enemy of the United States. Appeasement was never going to work. Why is that so difficult to understand? Wow, Hakeem Jeffries, I haven't heard that one before, that appeasement is not going to work and that basically Putin is Hitler. And so therefore we have to keep doing what you've done for the last decade plus, which is use Ukraine for a proxy war against Russia and its allies. That's like, but it's like, if appeasement is not going to work, like, how about your strategy? Is that working? Because the war's now gone on for, or at least the Russian invasion phase of the war has gone on for more than 3 years, hundreds of thousands of dead. I mean, how can we say that is working? And by the way, Putin's never said, I'm an enemy of the United States. Like, he's not a sworn enemy of the U.S. Like, if you're going to call someone a sworn enemy, they have to do some swearing in. Like, they have to say, I am a sworn enemy of the U.S. But he's never said that. He's actually talked about, the U.S. once being partners of the U.S. and he wants to restore that. So they really got to get out of the comic book realm and try to get into reality.
The comic book Cold War realm, yeah. Well, Aaron, to put this in terms that I think Hakeem Jeffries would put him, we want annihilation, not appeasement. Proxy wars, not peace.
It's good.
Cold War, not cooperation.
That's right. That's good. Yeah. That's good. And yes. And Hakeem Jeffries, I mean, last time we checked in on him, he had actually signed a new deal for, like, I'm not joking. He signed a children's book deal based on that alliteration speech he gave, where he just threw out a letter and then put a flowery word next to it. And we're all supposed to be really impressed by that. So, yeah. But another Democratic voice, an influential one on foreign policy, is another person who's in cognitive decline. I think it's pretty safe to say that about him. That's John Fetterman, who's had serious issues and has been a vocal proponent of Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza. And this is what he said recently about Trump's efforts to negotiate with Iran. There's no point in negotiating with Iran. Impossible to verify or trust this regime. We must fully support Israel's rightful decision to hit Iran's nuclear facilities. That's John Fetterman, everybody, doing his job not as a senator, because as we're going to actually about to see, he doesn't want to do that job, but he does love being an advocate for Israeli aggression. And this comes amid reports that the Trump administration has been rebuffing Israeli pressure to bomb Iran. And there have been story after story about this, where Israel's really pushing Trump to bomb Iran, but Trump so far doesn't want to go along with that.
One more thing I got to add, because I feel like I got to channel Hakeem Jeffries once more. Nihilism, not negotiation.
Very good. Yes. Well, John Fetterman would certainly embrace that. And John Fetterman is certainly feeling very upset right now because people are putting pressure on him to go to work. Yes, he's been like shamed, he says, to show up at the Senate, which he doesn't want to do. And there's a recent article in the New York Times about this, and this is some of what it said. Mr. Fetterman, who represents 13 million people, said he felt he'd been unfairly shamed into fulfilling senatorial duties, such as participating in committee work and casting procedural votes on the floor, dismissing them as a performative waste of time. Instead, he said he was showing up because people in the media have weaponized his absenteeism on Capitol Hill to portray him as mentally unfit, when in fact it is a product of a decision to spend more time at home and less on the mundane tasks of being a senator. So John Fetterman can take the time to, call for bombing Iran, but he can't take the time to show up for work. He's certainly an entertaining guy to have there in the Senate. I will say that about him.
I like it. He's like a corporate creative kind of. I like the way he's pushing the boundaries on what on workflow. So for Republicans suck, here is a story about someone who I wish would stay home and show up to work less, and that is Marco Rubio. The Trump administration announced that they are halting the processing of visas for foreign students, and it is preparing to require additional social media vetting for every applicant. And here is Marco Rubio making this announcement.
Under President Trump, the United States will stand with the Jewish people. We have
So basically, what we have there is Marco Rubio using the shooting at the Jewish Museum to justify trying to normalize relationships with Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords, which were largely seen as one of the things that provoked October 7th. And he's also using this as an excuse, obviously, to crack down on free speech. So what is it that Hillary Clinton said? Never let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah, I mean, again, these same people talk about they're trying to stop hatred against the Jewish people when they're the ones spreading it by conflating Jewish people with the psychotic mass murdering state and trying to censor anybody, including foreign students, who criticizes it. I mean, and by the way, Rubio's still going around. He's complaining still about foreign countries that censor Americans. And he's like, if we find, like, literally, I'm not joking, like, he's been putting out statements like this, like, if we find out you've been censoring Americans, we're going to take action against you because we defend our free speech. While he's censoring people for doing things like writing op-eds critical of Israel. It's, to say it's dystopian and head spinning is really just doesn't capture how insane all this is. And I just amazed, like, does Marco, like, when the camera stopped rolling, is Marco Rubio, like, are they laughing? Is it funny to them that they're like complaining about free speech while cracking down on everyone's free speech? It's very strange.
Free speech for me, not for thee. And also, you mentioned how it really is contributing to anti-Semitism, or it's going to contribute to anti-Semitism. But also, does he think it's a good look for Jews to pretend that they're doing the terrible things that they're doing in the name of Jews?
Yeah, well, they obviously don't care about that.
Right.
I mean, there is an evangelical component here, and the evangelical agenda is to, like, have the rapture and have a lot of Jews killed unless they convert. So that's what they're pushing everything toward, and which means cracking down on free speech and cutting off students who, like, contribute a lot to society. Foreign students, like, end up, being a huge part of the education system here. They get a good education. They contribute to society. And in the name of this one foreign apartheid state, Marco Rubio wants to curtail that as well. It's just on top of how evil it is, it's also very self-defeating.
Yeah, it really is. It's I mean, you almost can't make this up. All right, what do we got for Isn't That Weird?
For Isn't That Weird, let's turn to Jake Tapper. He's making the rounds promoting his new book, which is all about how Democrats and the media covered up Joe Biden's cognitive decline at the end of his term. Now, what Jake Tapper also has to face scrutiny over is that he took part in that cover-up. He attacked people, including journalists, who wrote about Biden's cognitive decline. Now he's profiting off of writing a whole book on it. But anyway, he, as part of his media tour, he shared this penetrating insight about journalism that he learned from the Biden cover-up affair, which is that, guess what, everybody? Politicians lie to us.
Especially if you're Jake Tapper, because what is it? A face only a mother could love? Well, he's like a personality only a mother could love.
Wow, that's so deep, Jake Tapper. I love how it takes Joe Biden's aides covering up his cognitive decline and Jake Tapper participating in the cover up for him to realize that politicians lie to us. Like the most blatant, obvious lie, which he took part in, is now exposed. So now he has to admit that politicians lie to us. He's been in journalism for a few decades now. Like when you start journalism, that should be your starting point, that people lie to you. You shouldn't take decades, including just a massively embarrassing scandal that you took part in, for you to realize that and acknowledge it publicly.
Well, also, I like the fact that he, in a statement about how governments lie, he quotes Henry Kissinger. I mean, he doesn't quote him, but that's who he's quoting when he's talking about power being the ultimate aphrodisiac. That was a Kissinger line. So I guess he's showing instead of telling. Useful Idiots is sponsored by CrowdHealth.com. In the last year, 1 in 5 Obamacare claims were denied to patients. And claim denials are becoming more and more common. That's unacceptable. Health insurance is confusing, expensive, and frustrating. But the headache of health insurance is exactly why CrowdHealth was created. It's not health insurance, it's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. Hospital bills are crazy, racking up unpayable costs of tens of thousands of dollars per night. With CrowdHealth, this doesn't have to become a financial emergency. By signing up for one of their plans, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help out in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. Let CrowdHealth help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months by using code USEFUL at joincrowdhealth.com. CrowdHealth is not insurance. Learn more at joincrowdhealth.com. That's joincrowdhealth.com, code USEFUL. For Isn't That Terrible? Let's take a look at some comments that were made at the UN Security Council by the U.S. alternate representative to the UN, John Kelly, speaking about Palestinian statehood. Let's hear what he had to say. I like that argument because he's pretending that they oppose something because of October 7th, as if they've been for it ever. But certainly, they've definitely blocked it in substantively. They've shown some rhetorical support for it, but we know now that Israel doesn't even show any rhetorical support for it. But it's so great because this is such a hyperbolic example of starting history on October 7th.
Going back to the mid 1970s, there have been votes at the UN for calling for a Palestinian state, like a two-state solution, which the U.S. claims to support. Every time the U.S. votes no, it's vetoed that countless times under every administration, including Obama. Whenever there's a vote at the UN on a Palestinian state, U.S. always votes no, without exception. And so now, as you said, they want to pretend as if their no to a Palestinian state is somehow because of October 7th, when they've been blocking this for well over 40 years. Literally, the only parties in the world that oppose a Palestinian state are Israel and the U.S. And it's because of them that it's never happened. And now they want to pretend that October 7th is listen, we love to support a Palestinian state. We'd love to give it to them, but October 7th, it'd be unconscionable. And
Right.
this is the same government that gives Israel billions and billions of dollars as it continues to carry out mass slaughter. So it's like, if killing people cannot be rewarded, why are you constantly rewarding Israel with all the weaponry and money it needs to carry out mass murder. And again, the comparison is not even close because the Palestinian resistance has killed just like a tiny fraction of what Israel kills. And also, these are not two equal parties. One is a occupied people resisting occupation that refuses to give them a state of their own, refuses to give them self-determination, which is just a basic fact that the U.S. will never acknowledge, but that's what underpins all of this.
Well, Aaron, I actually think that this really speaks to the prescience of the United States and the fact that they are so forward-thinking and experienced, and they learned so much from history that they actually were able to predict October 7th for decades. And they knew October 7th was going to happen, and that's why they blocked the statehood, Palestinian statehood.
The telepathic powers of the U.S. government,
Exactly.
really, really, really impressive. Really impressive.
Yeah.
And those have been your 4 basic food groups. For this week's guest, we are joined by Mohammed Shahada. He is a political analyst and writer from Gaza. We have relied on him so much ever since October 7th to provide us with the information that cuts through the propaganda that we're subjected to in the West. And Mohammed is so knowledgeable about Gaza, so knowledgeable in debunking all the lies that Israel and its apologists put out. And this week, there's so much to get into, including talk of a potential new ceasefire, and Israel, of course, traditionally claiming that Hamas is the only obstacle, and also this new fake aid group that Israel and the U.S. set up in Gaza to advance ethnic cleansing. So let's go to Mohammed Shahada to discuss all this and more. Mohammed Shahada, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thanks so much for having me.
As we're recording this, there's talk of a potential ceasefire, a brief ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. But before we get to that, let's talk about one of the major stories of this week. Among, countless Israeli atrocities in Gaza, you had the emergence of this new so-called aid mechanism, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, basically an Israeli front group setting up a site in southern Gaza to give meager amounts of aid to Palestinians desperate for food. And we saw these horrific scenes that were reminiscent of the Nazi Holocaust, people caged, people being fired at, Palestinians reportedly being even kidnapped while going to wait for this aid. I mean, just for people who are not aware of what has happened and who have heard the Israeli claim that this is all a response to the failures of the UN and Hamas hoarding aid, and they're just trying to do what they can to get aid to desperate people. Just talk to us about what people should know about this whole fake aid mechanism.
Well, to put it mildly, if you combine together the movies Mad Max, Fallout, Minority Report, and Black Mirror together, you would get exactly what this scenario is. So it's basically a fenced concentration camp that is run by American mercenaries, surrounded by the IDF, by Israeli tanks and soldiers, and who established a number of checkpoints leading up to these concentration camps. These checkpoints are provided with facial recognition technology, as well as the concentration camp itself. It has lots of different layers of biometric screening. So basically, one of the main concerns for people there is whenever I talk to any colleague or friend in Gaza and asked, would you go there? They said you would have to be completely out of your mind to step a foot into that trap. They saw it as a bait rather than anything to do with humanitarian aid, because to get there, you have to cross a number of Israeli checkpoints where you can be kidnapped or detained at any moment without any explanation. And that's the last your family would ever hear of you. I literally have a friend whose brother was kidnapped at one of those checkpoints by Israel. And they literally said that he was being held under the Illegal Combatants Act, which means that he's held without Red Cross visitations, legal counsel, trial, charges, or even any suspicion. Like, they don't have anything against him. He asked, why am I being held? And they said, we have a picture of you at a demonstration from 2011 when he was a kid. And at the same demonstration, there were members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement, so guilt by association, basically. And they said, we will release you one day when there is a ceasefire agreement with Hamas in which we can trade you for some of our captives in Gaza. That was explicitly being held as a hostage. So the vast majority of Gazans are very terrified of the idea of walking there because of the possibility of being kidnapped on the way. That's number one. Number two, the setup the way this organization functions, it establishes 4 heavily militarized, fenced hubs or concentration camps, all in the very south of Gaza. One of them is on the south of the Netzarim corridor, which is the most obvious exploitation of food as a way of luring people away from northern Gaza, as a way of forcible transfer, mass expulsion, basically. And now it coincides conveniently with the IDF saying that they have plans to conquer all of Gaza and concentrate the entire population beyond the Morag corridor, so basically on the borders with Egypt. Bezalel Smotrich gave us the ending. He spoiled the ending of this plan by saying that once they are on the borders with Egypt, then God's help, they will be expelled beyond Gaza into third countries. So that's the second concern. The third concern is basically the clear risk of mass interment. And that is something that the United Nations and every single humanitarian organization on the face of earth that has anything to do with Gaza has warned about recently in an internal memo that was given to different member states of the United Nations to tell them, do not fund this ploy, do not fund this Israeli shill organization. And there they explicitly say there is a clear, credible risk of mass interment in which Israel would confine people in inhumane conditions, in fenced cages. What we saw on pictures, basically people being herded like cattle into feeding pens under the boiling sun of the desert, surrounded by sand dunes and IDF tanks and troops and mercenaries, and waiting endlessly. Either you get a package of food, or you get shot dead, or you get kidnapped, or you get maimed. You never know. It's like a lottery. It's like the Hunger Games. And then there is the fourth layer, that basically this entire apparatus is the ultimate tool of blackmail and collective punishment. So it only is supposed to provide aid to half of the population. The other half, they're supposed to starve to death, which means that Israel and that mercenary group, the Shell Israeli organization, would get to decide who gets aid and who starves to death. So if you're a journalist that criticized Israel, if you're a humanitarian worker, if you're anybody that ever wrote anything critical of Israel on social media, there's a chance you would be banned from getting that aid, or you would not be chosen this time. You would be pushed to the back of the queue, any kind of manipulation for collective punishment. Or if Israel is interested in sort of baiting you into becoming an informant or an intelligence asset, they would say, come and get a food box in return for providing this critical information that would lead to the death of many. So that's basically the apparatus you have in place. And the last element of it is the surefire recipe for incentivizing looting. When you give people half of the population, you give them aid, and the other half is doomed to starvation, looting is going to spiral out of control. It's going to be more widespread than ever. And there's the element that basically this entire plan is practically unworkable. So what it means in practice is that, for example, I have family in the very north of Gaza, in Beit Hanun, Beit Lahi, and Jabalia. If they get a call to pick up the aid, they have to walk on foot for 41 kilometers, literally for 41 kilometers, a whole day, to pick up a package that weighs about 20 kilos, about 40 pounds, and carry it on foot for 41 kilometers back, supposing that they would not be stopped on the way by the IDF or by criminal gangs or by anyone that tries to loot that package. And they would have to do this once a week or once every 5 days. So the idea is logistically impossible. If you put all these factors together, no wonder not a single country on the face of earth other than Israel and the United States are funding this project. Even the United Arab Emirates refused and backed out of it.
What do you have to say to the claim that you've debunked that this is all Hamas is doing? This is all the doing of Hamas?
Well, basically, you have to take the words of Israel itself when it comes to the claim Hamas is looting aid. So the IDF itself conducted an internal review a couple of days ago, and they looked at 110 looting incidents that they recorded recently, and they said none of them, zero, none of them were carried out by Hamas. The IDF says they were all carried out by criminal gangs, armed clans, and desperate civilians. Those criminal gangs are basically backed by Israel. They operate in areas under full Israeli control that the IDF has rendered extermination zones. That's literally the practical term they use for it, which means any Palestinian that walks in there would be neutralized, killed or maimed or kidnapped on sight. So those people are operating in these extermination zones openly under IDF protection. The UN said they operate under passive or active Israeli protection. They even set up a military complex. There were even recently, last week, pictures of those gang leaders and warlords, drug dealers, in military gear, in uniform, in close proximity to Israeli troops and to the Israeli borders. They were like hundreds of meters away from the Israeli Kerem Shalom crossing, where all the humanitarian aid goes into Gaza. That's why you had an episode where the United Arab Emirates came out and condemned Israel strongly because they tried to send 103 trucks into Gaza. Israel allowed only 24 and forced the truck drivers to drive through what is called a red zone, where all the gangs operate. So 23 out of 24 got looted. Only one truck made it to the bakery, which pushed the Emirates to strongly condemn this, although they're sort of very close allies with Israel because of the Abraham Accords. If you look, for example, at Cindy McCain, the widow of one of the most pro-Israeli senators in U.S. history, she basically said the looting, quote, has nothing to do with Hamas. It is desperate people. It is the desperation that Israel created that is pushing people to loot.
Have you seen evidence that it is Hamas stealing the food?
No, not at all. Not in this round. Listen, these people are desperate, and they see a World Food Program truck coming in, and they run for it. This doesn't have anything to do with Hamas or any kind of organized crime or anything. It has simply to do with the fact these people are starving to death.
If you look, for example, at David Satterfield, Biden's humanitarian envoy, on two separate occasions, so in February last year and 2 days ago, he came out and said, quote, Israel never privately alleged, let alone provided evidence of Hamas looting aid.
That Hamas was stealing, profiting, and diverting the majority of the aid that was coming in. That is Israel's claim. How do you respond to that?
No such allegation or evidence in support of allegations like that were ever provided privately by informed Israeli security or political officials. It is a claim which, on the face of it, is not reflected in any of the experience that those involved in the humanitarian effort have seen.
So the talking points they feed to people in the mainstream media and social media is one thing, and what they tell their own closest ally, the United States, is totally another. They didn't even dare allege that this was happening, but use basic common sense. Ask the Israeli propagandists, why would Hamas loot the aid this way? The answer by Israel itself and by the U.S. ambassador to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, Mike Huckabee, is Hamas is looting aid to buy weapons. From where? Amazon, Walmart. Gaza is completely sealed off. Where do you get weapons from? Then the second answer, the backup answer, is Hamas loots aid to sell on the market and make money. And what would they use the money for? To buy more food, because the only thing you have in Gaza right now that Israel allows in is food. Then you get the other layer. Hamas is looting aid to sell on the market, to make money, to give to its members to buy food again. But how many members does Hamas have? They have 30,000 members per Israel's own accounting. They increased now to 40,000 in Israeli recent estimates out of 2.4 million people. Like the human capacity to eat food that is allocated for 2.4 million people and then given to 30,000, that is physically impossible. But then the strongest element of all, Israel has the most meticulous surveillance on planet Earth of Gaza. They surveil every single inch, every single square with surveillance drones, predator drones, and satellite imagery, wiretapping, intercepting phone signals, intercepting phone calls, intercepting messages, as well as the IDF troops on the ground. And they couldn't find a single footage of Hamas looting aid. And it's also counterintuitive. Like if Hamas was to divert a truck from its predetermined route, because Israel is the one that determines the road that the trucks should go on, if any of the trucks deviate, Israel would bomb it on the spot. We've seen multiple instances in which Israel would bomb a humanitarian convoy because policemen approached to prevent looting. And as soon as a drone spotted a Hamas policeman, they rendered them a sufficient target to bomb a whole humanitarian convoy. So, like, the totality of it is just a talking point to externalize blame for Israel's starvation policy in Gaza.
Putting these fake aid zones in the south, that's a way to push everybody in Gaza there to help advance the ethnic cleansing goal of Israel. But talk to us about this in the context of Israel's war on UNRWA, the main UN agency working in Gaza, that keeps Palestinians in Gaza alive. Why this Israeli campaign to basically make UNRWA and the UN system in Gaza obsolete?
Well, basically, the cornerstone of this plan is to elbow out UNRWA and virtually every single international organization that works in Gaza, every UN agency, to just kick them out entirely. You saw recently the Israeli legislation that is being advanced in the Knesset that would raise taxes on civil society organizations and humanitarian organizations to 80%, astronomical levels, as well as Israel forcing these organizations to go through an undisclosed, untransparent screening process in which Israel would screen every person that works at each of these organizations, not the ones that are operating in Gaza, but every person absolute, every person that works at this organization, period. So if you have an accountant in New York that once criticized Israel on Twitter 10 years ago, they might use that against you and disqualify the entire organization from operating. So that was the legislation being advanced. But now to speed it up, to sort of hasten this process, they're elbowing out these organizations with this shill Israeli company, a mercenary group on the ground. The rationale, it's not only to have the ultimate control of aid. Israel wants to decide who gets aid, who starves. This is one objective. But another is because these organizations function as witnesses of the atrocities, the genocide that Israel is inflicting in Gaza. If you look at South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ, basically all the footnotes are UN agency reports from the ground in Gaza on every atrocity that Israel was unleashing. But if you take these agencies out, you create the perfect sort of cover-up. You create an informational blackout. For UNRWA in particular, Israel's destruction of UNRWA is part and parcel of the genocide in Gaza and a broader genocide against Palestinians. Now you have Ehud Olmert saying that Israeli settler leaders are making a genocidal declaration against the West Bank. Olmert is Israel's former prime minister, right-wing hawk from Netanyahu's Likud party before Netanyahu ever joined the Likud party. And now he's admitting there's a war of annihilation in Gaza and a declaration of genocide in the West Bank. And if you want to advance this genocide, one of the first cornerstones of it would be to go after UNRWA, because UNRWA plays not just the role of being the lifeline to Palestinians, but it sort of shoulders a heavy burden of lifting up the Palestinian economy. So UNRWA is one of the largest employers in the occupied Palestinian territory, and they shoulder up a heavy burden of providing transformational services. Not just the food, not just the healthcare, but they also provide vital, high-quality education. Like I'm speaking now to you in English that I only learned in my UNRWA school. I learned everything that I know basically from my UNRWA education, without which I would have been a destitute refugee in a camp running with rags and barefoot. So basically this transformational role that allows Palestinians to stand on their feet. And finally, UNRWA is the longest witness of everything that Israel has ever done to Palestinians since the Nakba, since 1948, when UNRWA began its operations the year after in the occupied territory. So removing UNRWA in Israel's mind advances genocide, takes away a vital witness, destroys evidence, and more importantly, from an Israeli perspective, although this is a naive and childish idea, to destroy the Palestinian right of return, to pretend that Palestinian refugees don't exist, where basically Israel thinks that if they destroy UNRWA, I will forget where my father came from. I will forget my grandfather's story, that basically with a press of a button, Palestinians would collectively let go of their refugeehood, of their right to return, and say, UNRWA's gone, now I cannot be a refugee anymore. It's ridiculous. But from an Israeli perspective, that's where the Israeli government is at now. They're at a stage of pursuing sort of victory images, one after the other, to satisfy a population that wants Palestinians gone. An overwhelming majority of Israel wants Gaza depopulated fully. And to make them feel that this is possible, you have to show them, okay, look, we're dismantling the biggest lifeline for Palestinians. Gaza is now officially uninhabitable.
Israel could have gone the route of, some Western European countries, which have, there's been some acknowledgement, for example, here in the U.S. of the genocide of Native Americans and some regret for it. Israel could have gone that route and apologized for it and tried to do what it could to compensate people and to give people their rights. Instead, it's gone full ahead with the ethnic cleansing that launched it as a state. And now it wants, to your point, now wants to eliminate the agency that keeps, Palestinians' refugee status in everyone's living memory. And somehow, as you said, by taking away the refugee agency, somehow that will just take away people's understanding of themselves as refugees. And Ehud Olmert, I don't want to discount the significance of him saying what he's saying now, but of course, where was he a year and a half ago when Israeli leaders made their intentions very, very clear?
Oh, well, basically, for the last 19 months, Israeli society, the Israeli mainstream, hoped that the genocide would work. That was the ambition, that it would be carried out successfully, that Gaza would fade away, people will be exhausted, there would be global fatigue, and then Gaza would be no more. And now they see that it's jumping back to the mainstream. So you see some Israeli sort of old guard or gatekeepers jumping and trying to salvage Israel's image to say, look, not all of us are like Netanyahu. The genocide is Netanyahu's fault. It's not ours. Look, there are good Israelis in leadership positions or that were in leadership positions before. But there's the other element. It's not that Israelis deny the genocide that's happening in Gaza. They know pretty well. And for example, I had a conversation with an Israeli journalist recently, and I asked her, okay, if Hamas is dismantled, if Hamas disappears, and the captives, the hostages are returned, and Gaza is fully disarmed, would Israel lift the blockade on Gaza? And her response was, she was very honest. She said, you think that Israel would feel safe living next to Gazans after everything we've done to them? Now they have a revenge incentive. We wouldn't sleep soundly. So they want them gone. That was basically the logical conclusion. We've done a genocide to you guys. You're not going to forgive us for it. So the convenient way is either we atone for it and make amends, or we kick you out. But we have absolute immunity. So let's do that. And that's the point right now where you have European governments speaking. It's ridiculous in the way that it's like them looking at a murder spree, a killing spree, and condemning that killing spree while giving the killer a sharper knife. Or telling a pyromaniac that, look, setting a fire, playing with fire is dangerous, but here is a lighter, here's a gasoline and a Red Bull, have fun. And that's exactly the approach you're having now. You have Germany saying the war in Gaza is unjustifiable. You have German members of parliament saying there should be an arms embargo. You have the German chancellor saying, this is no longer a war against Hamas. And then the foreign minister comes and says, there would not be any arms embargo on Israel. Weapons will keep flowing.
So you have Germany's chancellor saying Israel's Gaza offensive is no longer justified as a fight against Hamas, which is, I guess, progress in some ways. But of course, it's a total lie, as if this was ever a fight against Hamas and not an all-out assault on civilians. So what do you think of this kind of shifting rhetoric that we're seeing from some European leaders?
Well, basically, rats abandoning ship. They got to a point where they see that Gaza's genocide is now jumping into the mainstream media, and they feel a need to save face. So you saw the Financial Times basically shaming Western governments and saying your silence on Gaza is shameful. And you have Gaza more and more, the atrocities there being condemned by people like Piers Morgan and others from mainstream backgrounds. And that sort of put European leaders on a state of panic, where they feel that they need to just show a little bit more of sort of rhetorical prowess. In addition, it's not just Gaza going into the mainstream, it's also Israel being drunk on invincibility from Trump's second term and feeling that they can say and do anything they want. And then you got Netanyahu saying, we are destroying homes in Gaza one after the other, so people would have nothing to go back to and they would leave. Or Smotrich saying, we are destroying everything that remained of Gaza and we will kick them out at the end of it. And like you had literally a member of Knesset, Sevi Sakut, who said, we are killing 100 people per day in Gaza and it doesn't make headlines anymore. The world has moved on. So with these statements happening now after 20 months of genocide, it makes it very difficult for European leaders to pretend that these statements were either a result of what they called Israel being traumatized, being in a state of shock. That's literally what they were telling us. And I always told them, like, okay, so Israel is in a state of shock because October 7th reminded Israel of Jews in concentration camps or of Holocausts. I'm willing to concede that point. But for me as a Palestinian, I don't need to look 80 years ago to activate my trauma. October 6th itself was the bloodiest year in modern Palestinian history in the West Bank, 2022 and 23, the two single bloodiest years since records began in the West Bank. And in Gaza itself, where you had scores killed by Israel the days before, or my own family in Gaza just being starved constantly for the last 17 years. And you don't see me calling for genocide or making similar outlandish statements, but rather the opposite. Like, it's not trauma, it is impunity that Israel is being told, do whatever you want, you can get away with it. And that impunity is absolutely corrupting. It gets the worst out of people. And it got Israel to a place of being unhinged. But with European leaders, what they have been telling us behind closed doors for the last 19, 20 months is basically the same that they are daring to say now in public. So I met a European leader in July last year, and first thing he says in the room, Israel is wiping out Gaza systematically, so nothing of it would stay, so people would have to leave. And he showed us satellite imagery that the EU was collecting on Gaza, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood, where I zoomed in, and I couldn't recognize anything. There was nothing standing. And he says, we are completely irrelevant, we're completely useless. We are very good-hearted. We give Israel bombs in the morning, and then we give Gaza bandages in the afternoon to cover the wounds from the bombs we gave Israel. So they knew what they were doing. Now you got it to a point where they can no longer pretend, where Israel made it indefensible, what they're doing in Gaza, and made it abundantly clear, the end goal, what it would be, a mass expulsion, finishing off a genocide, that it became too difficult for those leaders to maneuver. But what they're doing now is just sort of a last-ditch attempt to defend Israel by giving it a warning shot instead of taking any action, of saying, okay, we are now, like the EU High Representative, Kaya Kalas, she said, we are carrying out a review whether or not Israel violated human rights in Palestine. And they already conducted 2 reviews. One of them was leaked in December last year by the EU Special Rapporteur, Kog. And he basically found Israel guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and basically violating the entire agreement into virtual obsolescence. They didn't do anything about it. So by saying we will conduct a review to see whether or not the building right in front of me that's on fire is actually on fire, it's just buying more time. It's giving Israel some extra time to finish the job.
You know, what you said earlier about how this Israeli journalist said, of course, we can never feel safe living next to these people because they're going to want to avenge us for all the killing that we've done, really reminds me of Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the Nazi SS, who justified killing children because he said, if we just kill the Jewish adults, then their children will, quote, grow up to become avengers. So just one of the many similarities that we're seeing between the Nazi genocide and this genocide.
Well, Israel was using this revenge sort of logic as a legal terminology. So, for example, I applied once for an exit permit to travel out of Gaza, and I never got the permit. It's still being processed until today. If you open the website, it says it's still being processed. It's almost been 10 years now. And when I applied, I contacted an Israeli human rights organization. It's called Gisha, that provides legal help and advice to Palestinians in terms of freedom of movement. And the first question they asked me is, did Israel ever kill any members of your family? Or did Israel ever imprison any members of your family? Or did Israel ever bomb your home? Because if Israel did any of these things, you have forfeited your right to travel because you have a revenge incentive. You would not be allowed out. It was as clear as the sun. And that was basically the Israeli logic back then, like almost 10 years ago, consistently, ever since Israel imposed this ultimate regime of control. Like, people are always sort of horrified at China's idea that surfaced many years ago of like the social credit scoring system. Israel implemented that years ago. They now have it like the upgrade version of it, where they would give you a social score on whether or not you are worthy of living. So they would give you literally this artificial intelligence would scrap all your information off the internet, WhatsApp messages, WhatsApp groups, Facebook activities, Twitter activities, and it would give you a ranking, a number. And that number tells the Israeli drone operator or the Israeli army whether or not your life is worth keeping or if you are a legitimate target based on a social score. If any country on earth implemented that, even if it was North Korea, if North Korea did this, can you imagine how many heads would turn? It doesn't even make any mention in mainstream media.
And what goes into that score?
It basically, what goes into it, who did you ever contact? So, for example, on WhatsApp, it would have a record of the people that you've contacted, the groups you've been a member of. The messages are encrypted, but they would know who you've been in touch with. They would look at what kind of posts did you like on social media, for example, on Facebook or on Instagram, or what kind of posts did you post on Twitter or on TikTok. And they would scrape all of that data, the mass sort of big data, and process it through artificial intelligence to give a probability. How likely is this guy to be supportive of Hamas or supportive of armed resistance or critical of Israel? And basically, like, you have the Israeli system gospel, and then you have the next level of artificial atrocity is basically, it's called Where's Daddy, where once they pick up a target, they wouldn't bomb that target on the spot. They would wait until that individual walks into their home and sits down with their families and sleep down in their bed. And then they would bomb the entire family. So the entire family is erased, children, women, elderly gone. So in that sense, that claimed target was not the target, but was the pretext for bombing and massacring a whole bunch of people.
So, Mohammed, as we're recording this, there is talk of a potential ceasefire deal. The word from the White House is that Israel has accepted these U.S. terms. And as far as we know, the centerpiece of this proposal is that there's a pause to Israel's mass murder for 60 days and some more aid gets in. But after that, there's no guarantee that the genocide doesn't resume. From what you've seen so far, and again, this is all very tentative, what is your understanding of this new potential deal that's on the table?
So basically, you had the last ceasefire that Israel collapsed completely and did not observe at all. Israel violated the ceasefire that they signed, a written agreement Netanyahu signed. They violated it about 1,000 times. They killed about 150 Palestinians during the ceasefire, and then on the opening day of collapsing it, they killed over 300. So that ceasefire is obsolete now. Witkoff proposed a new one in February this year. In March this year, and that new ceasefire was discarding everything that was agreed upon before in a written agreement and proposing something new from scratch, in which it gives Netanyahu everything he wanted and tells Hamas and Palestinians, trust the graciousness of the Israelis, that they would feel sorry for you once all the captives and hostages are back, and they would stop the genocide. That's basically the premise. All the back and forth ever since was basically about trying to convince Netanyahu to provide any guarantee whatsoever that he would end the war after this. And Netanyahu didn't budge. So instead, the Israelis were telling Witkoff and telling Trump that they need to apply pressure on Hamas, on Gaza, in order for Hamas to become more lenient. But Hamas was already at their most lenient position possible. They were offering to step down from government in Gaza, hand it over to a technocratic independent committee. They were offering to basically lay down their arms, what Adam Boehler, Trump's hostage negotiator, talked about, that they would lay down their arms for the next 5 to 15 years as a truce, as a ceasefire, and they in both Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem. And they were willing to basically release all the captives that remained in Gaza on day one. And they went on and on with more and more concessions. They said, okay, the tunnels would be dismantled. There would be a protective mission in Gaza, an international mission. There would be a new security force trained by Egypt, Jordan, other countries that are in sort of peace agreement with Israel. And all of these that Hamas provided, it was basically a non-starter for Netanyahu. So on the day that Hamas sort of channeled to the negotiators, we are willing to lay down the arms, we are willing to not produce any new improvised projectiles or rockets, that is the day where Netanyahu comes out and says, no, this is a non-starter, this is not negotiable. And basically what he was demanding instead, he was saying clearly, the message was clear. He basically said, Hamas needs to disarm, they need to leave Gaza, and that needs to be done on a staged kind of theatrics, where they would go walk on top of a stage, hand over the weapons to an international force, and then leave the other way and go out of Gaza and like wave bye-bye and keep going. And after that, Israel would stay in Gaza and would continue military operations for quote security. They would maintain operational freedom, which means they go in and out whenever they want. And they would implement the Trump plan, which is depopulating Gaza, keeping Gaza uninhabitable and tightening the screws on the population there more and more until they basically choose to leave, which is another word for forcible expulsion, when you give people a choice between staying and starving to death or being killed by bombardment or leaving and never coming back. So that was the Netanyahu proposal. All the back and forth ever since was what Witkoff called a bridging outline, in which he tries to narrow the gap, tries to introduce some more vague vocabulary. And he got very close a few days ago when Hamas announced that it accepted the Witkoff parameter. And then Netanyahu said, no, absolutely not. This is a non-negotiable. This is a non-starter. This is horrendous. We will never accept this. And then you had Witkoff taking a step back and saying, nah, actually, the outline that Hamas approved is not the one that I gave to the Israelis, and Hamas rejected the one that I gave to Israel, so Hamas is the one that is disappointing me right now. And then another round of trying to bridge the gaps until we got to the outline that we have now, where basically the US is saying Trump will guarantee Israel will not bomb you when you give half of the captives that remain in Gaza, half of the living ones, when you give them to Israel within 7 days. They will not bomb you for 60 days. And after this, we will negotiate an extension of the ceasefire, not an end to the war, but an extension. And that extension is conditioned upon the agreement of both parties, which means Netanyahu would say, give me the remaining captives, I will give you another 60 days, or else I will resume the genocide. And it says the US will guarantee that there would be negotiations between Israel and Hamas on basically ending the war, ending the genocide. And it does not specify any sort of time frame for these negotiations or clear parameters. It leaves it open, like it's filled with loopholes. Basically, Witkoff sat down with Ron Dermer, Netanyahu's close confidant, and changed the outline to something that adopts everything Netanyahu ever wanted, where it says, we will negotiate on the end to the war, including Hamas day after, the number of hostages that would be released versus number of Palestinian hostages, captives, and prisoners. And it goes through some language, but the word including was the loophole to begin with. So in all of this, like even if you think that this agreement is impeccable and solid, Hamas has no incentive to trust that it would be implemented, because the first one was never implemented. Then the Americans came and said, trust us, give us Aidan Alexander, the Israeli American soldier that was captured in an Israeli tank. Give Aidan to us without anything in return. And we promise Trump will say, end the war, and aid would be allowed into Gaza again. Aidan Alexander comes out, Israel intensifies the bombardment. It doubles down, like literally the bombardment increased by about 100 to 200% as soon as Aidan Alexander was released. And then you had the starvation continuing, and Israel allowing basically a trickle, less than what prisoners got in the Gulag concentration camps. So on the first day, they allowed about 9 trucks of aid, which is basically, when you divide it by the population, it's 4 rice crackers per person, 4 rice crackers as the only meal they would get in about 80 days. So when you have Israel basically violating the first agreement, and then the Americans themselves violating the first and the second promise, like, what is the incentive to trust the third one?
How is your family doing? Where is your family? Where are your friends? How many of them are still in Gaza?
Well, some of them are in northern Gaza, some are in Gaza City, and some in the south. Many of my friends are now in Gaza City, colleagues and family as well. And one of them is staying in basically inside the ruins of a destroyed cultural center. It's called Rashad al-Shawa, with his child. His child was born, I think, 2 years before the genocide. And basically, the building is half collapsed. So he put up a tent in it along with other people as well. And basically, I told him, like, it's extremely dangerous. Why don't you just set up a tent outside? And he said, this is way better, even with the risk of the roof collapsing on their head and crushing them. This is way better. And that friend of mine, Ibrahim, before the genocide, he would always tell me, you made a mistake to travel outside Gaza. You should come back. It's not as bad as you think. You can basically survive. You can have a good life here. He was a programmer, so he managed to make a decent income by freelancing, by having customers from outside Gaza. He managed to transcend the blockade on Gaza. So he was one of the lucky few that could manage to make a living. And basically, when the genocide starts, Ibrahim was displaced multiple times, to the point where he wrote me once. Literally, he said, I'm sorry that I told you come back. Please remember me and pray for me. And then a blackout for a few months. And then I heard from him again, luckily. And then he tells me Israeli soldiers walked into his home, his apartment, and burned it to the ground. They didn't bomb it. They took their time to burn everything. There was nothing left of it. And now, like, when the ceasefire was signed, I talked to Ibrahim and I said, like, do you want to leave Gaza? And he said, nah, maybe for like a moment of respite, maybe to get some fresh air and then come back again. And now he's at a point of complete collapse where he's saying, my son is having constant seizures. I cannot do anything about it. I need to come out. And that's basically what Israel wanted all along. Like, you hosted Norman Finkelstein, who talked about his mother being asked by Amy Goodman, how was it on the day that she was liberated from the concentration camps? Was it the best day in her life? And she answered with complete horror, it was the worst day ever, because that's when she managed to process what it had meant to lose your entire family. And that was the Gaza ceasefire. It gave Gazans a moment to internalize, to process what it meant, because they were no longer on survival mode and the noise was down. And then back to genocide again. This is purely sadistic. It hurts 1,000 times more, because you managed to understand what it had meant to lose everything, to see your family and friends cut into pieces and driven over by tanks and hacked, and then you're back to it again without any ending in sight. So that's when you have people at a moment of collapse. I have another friend who's basically staying also in a bombed building with his daughter that's about 4 years old as well. And the same situation where I'm begging him, leave, the building might collapse. And he says, no, this is better than sleeping on the street, because on the street, you would be eaten alive by bugs, rats, mice, scorpions, snakes, mosquitoes, etc. So it's better to be inside something. And you have now people that have endured prolonged starvation to the moment of sustaining permanent damage, particularly for children. So children are in Gaza are now at a phase of stunted growth, which would inflict permanent suffering on them, permanent lifelong disabilities. But even for adults, I have a friend, Nada, who basically said that she's fainting. She's a breastfeeding mother whose son was born right about, I think, a month before the genocide or a few days before. And she's fainting all the time. She said people on the street suddenly collapse. Hospitals are overflowing with people to the point that doctors are rationing medicines and human resources. I have another colleague whose mother needed urgent medical treatment. And at the hospital, they said, we have to turn her back. She had her chance. There's no medicine, there's no food, there are no doctors available. So she had to take her mother home and watch her die, because the only available resources are now dedicated to children and people wounded by Israeli airstrikes. And it goes on and on with this. And on top of that, you have the non-stop, non-ending horror of Israeli carpet bombing and arbitrary shelling, artillery fire, and non-stop shooting. And it's all one-sided. It's not like they're engaging in battles or in war. The gunfire is coming from one direction, and that's it. And it's indiscriminate. And every day I see another report where someone walking on the street just got hit in the head with a loose shot fired from these machine guns by Israel, or someone got hit by shrapnel. And like with all of this, the worst part is to know that there's no end in sight and nobody's doing anything to guarantee an end soon. I get messages every day from colleagues, from family, from friends, literally begging me for an answer. When is this coming to an end? Is there any hope soon? And I try to like make up things. I try to give them some false hope from time to time. But I ran out after 20 months of telling them, okay, Netanyahu's government is about to collapse. The EU is about to speak up. Trump might be convinced otherwise. And then they see it 10 times not happening. I lost words. I like the worst sentence that I can say to someone in Gaza is stay safe. It feels insensitive, obtuse, and cruel. It's like mocking them because literally there's nothing to do to stay safe whatsoever.
Are you surprised at all by what Israel's doing? Is this qualitatively different from what they've done in the past? Because for me, it's as an outsider, it's both a continuation, but also it's almost like there's nothing that they won't do. So I find myself not surprised because of not just the founding history, but the genocidal history since the founding of Israel, the Nakba. But this does seem to be, I don't know if it's because it's being live streamed. There does seem to be some difference here. What do you think?
Well, I lived through 3 Israeli wars, 10 military operations, which is a euphemism for high-tech killing sprees, and 2 ground invasions. And this one is like nothing I've ever seen before, not even 1%. Nothing comes close. But the premise of it is similar. So Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillars of Defense, and Operation Protective Edge, 3 wars consecutively. After each one of them, Israel would, like during the war, would conduct this terror bombing, this starvation, all kinds of basic atrocities in order to terrorize people as he was basically a Zionist South African jurist, very pro-Israeli, a practicing Jew.
Goldstone?
Exactly, Richard Goldstone, who said Israel's objective was to, quote, punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population in Gaza, every civilian that lives there. And one of the goals was basically that after each war, people would leave. So it was sort of an attritional genocide of trying to create the conditions. Like the siege itself is the way to guarantee that people would have one of 2 choices, as Moshe Dayan put it in 1967. He said, we will tell Palestinians we have no solution. Whoever wants to stay here shall live like dogs, otherwise leave. And that's the idea of Israel's siege on Gaza. You have no life, no work, no opportunities. You cannot afford to start a family, move out of your parents' home. You cannot have, like, every time I see another friend's face, or a family member's face that were killed by Israel, the most crushing realization is them being killed before they ever got a chance to experience living, to know what a normal life looks like, what it is, what it feels like to have purpose, to have a job, to provide for yourself, to have your own place. And most people I know never got any of that. So basically, the siege was the guarantee to collapse people to leave. But it was sort of bolstered by these occasional massacres to terrorize people, to push as many people to leave as possible. And by October 7th, about 250,000 had left Gaza already. It was a statistic because the Palestinian authorities, they tried to keep it shrouded in mystery so as to not create an incentive for more people to leave. But the most recent statistic, I think from 2023, before the genocide, it said 250,000 people had left since Israel's siege on Gaza began. So basically, that was the premise. There was another similarity in terms of the cruelty of killing, where Israel would ambush ambulances and paramedics. They would basically shoot someone and let them scream for help for hours until an ambulance comes, and then they would bomb or shoot at the ambulance. Those were the testimonies recorded by Breaking the Silence. So you saw a lot of sort of horrendous activities, but nonetheless, there were some basic things that you can do during these wars to survive. So we knew if you stay at a hospital as a civilian, like when the bombardment increases, when there's a grand invasion, run to a UN school or run to a hospital, because the possibility of Israel bombing and killing 500 people in one go is not very major, it's not substantial. Or if you want to increase your possibilities of survival, try to stay around journalists, because Israel would not target them systematically. And now, if you do any of these things, you basically increase your chances of death. Israel is bombing hospitals one after the other in broad daylight. They're targeting journalists one after the other and admitting it. They're saying, okay, today we targeted and killed this journalist because he was, quote, a propaganda operative. I'm not sure how does that fit as a legal term, but that's where we are today. Or we bombed this hospital, or we killed those humanitarian workers, and brags about it constantly. So the other difference, in previous wars, Israel would destroy entire neighborhoods to leave it as a cautionary tale. So, for example, Shija'iyya in Operation Protective Edge, Shija'iyya was almost wiped out. I went with a friend on a motorbike. We kept driving and driving. The ruin was endless. The chief of the Red Cross visited Gaza, Peter Moorer, and he basically said that he's never seen such destruction in his life. He's been to Afghanistan, to Syria, to Yemen, to many war-torn countries, and that was 2014. So you saw Israel bragging, like Benny Gantz, the Minister of Defense, and before that he was Chief of Staff. He said, we turned parts of Gaza back to the Stone Age. That was Shija'iyya. They were bragging about it and leaving it as a cautionary tale. This time, they do not have an intention of leaving a cautionary tale. Like the previous logic was the Dahya doctrine, leave as much destruction as possible to create deterrence. So basically, Moshe Ya'alon, Bogi Ya'alon, the former Israeli Minister of Defense, very right-wing Likud leader before, now being an anti-Netanyahu critic, and he said in the early 2000s something like, we have to hammer and hammer and hammer until we burn into the living conscience of Palestinians that they cannot win.
You know, going back to Moshe Dayan, who you quoted just a few minutes ago, who said in 1967, when Israel began occupying the West Bank and Gaza, you quoted him saying, you know, basically Palestinians will live like dogs, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Well, Noam Chomsky would always point out when he would cite that quote that Moshe Dayan was considered to be like the most sympathetic towards Palestinians in the Israeli political spectrum. So the most sympathetic, you know, prominent Israeli general also said the Palestinians should live like dogs. So you can imagine what the Israelis who were not sympathetic, how they felt. And we're seeing that now with this genocide. But, you know, going back to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this fake Israeli front group that is in Gaza, also with the involvement of the U.S., you know, one detail I want to make sure we mention, the main group that's providing security, and we've seen footage of some of these American mercenaries on the ground, basically mocking Palestinians lining up for food in these cages, is a guy named Philip Riley, who's a former senior CIA officer who literally trained death squads in Central America back in the 1980s, including the Contras, which was used for, you know, a terror war backed by the U.S., by the Reagan administration in Nicaragua. So that's the kind of people that are now operating inside Gaza. I mean, literal death squad accomplices who come from the CIA. But amazingly, and I want to make sure that we discuss this, Jake Wood, who was a former U.S. Marine tapped to head the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, just as it was launching, he resigned, saying he couldn't take part in this because it just violated humanitarian principles. When, of course, he must have known that was the goal from the start, which was to like violate humanitarian principles. And I wonder what happened there, Mohammed. I'm curious your thoughts. Like, do you think he realized that if he took part in this, I mean, forget having a conscience, because I don't know how you could be a part of this thing to begin with, but maybe I'm just speculating, maybe he thought that he could be subject to criminal charges for taking part in this if he went ahead with it.
So a day before this shill organization began to operate, they basically shut down their registered headquarters in Geneva, in Switzerland. It was reported by Yedaot Ahranot, the Israeli newspaper, and they did it quietly. And they basically did it because the Swiss authorities were lamenting an investigation. So as soon as criminal liability, the prospect of it loomed in the background, that's when the rats abandoned ship. That's when you had the CEO quitting. Because, of course, it entails criminal liability when you operate a concentration camp in collaboration with Israel and use it as bait to get people to come to you either for forcible expulsion or to be kidnapped by or killed by Israel. We've seen now 11 people killed within less than 48 hours, 63 wounded, and multiple disappeared. So that is one element of it. The other is basically, we saw it earlier, where some people in this organization were written on the press releases or on official documents as members of the board or directors or officials, and they came from backgrounds like World Central Kitchen or the UN, etc. And then a lot of them distanced themselves and they denied any involvement and they recused themselves from this organization because it is a reputational hazard as well. If you want to have a career, like this organization is only temporary. It is tied to the genocide. It is tied to Israel finishing the job. But your life is going to continue after this, and your name would be attached to this forever. So that's why you saw people abandoning it, because the initial hope was that if they can manage to get any country, any at all, to fund this enterprise, they would hide behind that country and say, look, the Emirates is funding us or Germany is funding us, and hope that this creates some legitimacy. But they couldn't find any at all, none. And that's why you had Avigdor Lieberman, a former minister of defense, saying that this organization is being funded by the Mossad because they couldn't find anyone to fund it.
And Lieberman, he was complaining that it was costing Israel too much money, right? He wasn't like he wasn't like blowing the whistle on like this is an outrage. He was saying this fake shell organization is costing Israeli taxpayers too much money, and that's how he revealed it was funded by Mossad.
Yeah, precisely. But that's the thing I always tell those sort of Western diplomats is like, why are you subsidizing the genocide? Israel should be the one forced to provide the humanitarian aid in Gaza, because as soon as Israel is here, that their pockets are going to be emptied to provide food for the people they're genociding, they're going to call for ending that genocide as soon as it hurts economically, as soon as you're told you're going to pay for this. And that's how international law works. The occupying power is obligated to provide the humanitarian relief and food and guarantee the well-being of the people to occupy. It's basic logic. But instead, you have all those countries subsidizing the genocide, buying it more time, spending their money, their people's money, on basically allowing Israel to do whatever it wants cost-free, with a promise of collaborating either with emptying Gaza or reconstructing it if Israel fails with the idea of depopulation. That go ahead, knock down as many buildings as you want. Maybe we would fix this at the end of it with many strings attached, of course. And that's basic subsidization. But another point, like you mentioned, Moshe Dayan was a left-wing figure. Today's equivalent would be Yair Golan, the head of the Democrats, merger between Meretz and Labor. And basically, Yair Golan, early on in the genocide, he said that he advocated for starving Gazans to death until Hamas releases the hostages. And then before that, he was a commander of the IDF in the West Bank. And under his tenure, he took Palestinians systematically as human shields. He was reprimanded for it, never held accountable, never attuned, and basically proud of it. The other element is that when the Trump idea came out, which is Netanyahu's idea, he's just now calling it Trump's plan to recuse himself from the idea of depopulating Gaza. But when Trump held that press conference with Netanyahu and the idea began to float around more substantially, Yair Golan was asked about it, and he describes it as a fantastic idea. He says it's not going to work well, but it's a beautiful idea. We support voluntary migration from Gaza. I'm paraphrasing, but like literally, he was saying it on Israeli television. We as the Democrats, we support voluntary migration from Gaza. So that's where the Israeli left is today. It's like basically vegetarian vampires.
As a final question from me, Mohammed, I wanted to ask you if you see any difference between having Joe Biden as president of the United States and having Donald Trump in terms of what is happening now in Gaza?
Well, basically many differences. One of them is that Biden was in a league of his own in terms of being atrocious, monstrous, and heartless. Biden saw everything that was happening and sugarcoated it. He just provided the ultimate cover for Israel to do whatever they wanted. You had this recent documentary in which Israeli and American officials are admitting Biden never told Israel once to end the war, never asked them to do a ceasefire. He just allowed them to play out negotiations as cover to buy time. So every time any European government would tell them end the war or try to ask behind closed doors, Israel would say, yeah, we are negotiating a deal. It's imminent. Don't criticize us publicly because this would undermine the deal and embolden Hamas. The deal is very close. We just need to maintain pressure until they fold. And that was Biden that allowed them this cover in the first place. There was a Saudi official that I asked during Biden's lame duck period. And I said, are you trying to ask him to do anything differently for his legacy? And the answer was, we tried, he wouldn't budge, absolutely zero. He wouldn't change a thing because he considered any change of his foreign policy on Gaza or Israel to be, quote, tainting his reputation, tainting his legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the most pro-Israeli president alive. And for him, it was like a mix of different things, but one of them was like pure ideological fanaticism. With Trump is not ideological. He's horrible in many ways. He's gave Israel back the 2,000-pound bombs that kill people within a radius of 300 meters, within a radius of like almost, it vaporizes people upon immediate impact within a radius of 150 meters, and it creates a fireball of 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Trump gave it to Israel again immediately. He removed the sanctions from the Israeli extremist lunatic groups, and he did everything that Israel wanted. But at the same time, you're seeing Trump basically calling out the war in Gaza and trying to get it to an end and trying to negotiate a deal. Of course, the deal is catering to Netanyahu's preferences. But as soon as Trump walked into office, even before on his inauguration day, he managed to get the deal that Biden could have gotten a year before and never tried, never even wanted to. He just left it up to Netanyahu to do whatever he wanted. What mediators are telling us is basically two things. Number one, if you physically go into the White House, it's now minimally staffed. There's no people working there. And on the Gaza file, it's only Witkoff and Trump and occasionally J.D. Vance that dictate on this. Marco Rubio, the State Department, the National Security Council are not even in the loop on what goes on with the negotiations. And the other thing is that I was told that Witkoff was serious, early on at least. He was serious about getting a deal done. Even when the deal collapsed, he was trying to work something out. He, of course, ended up taking Netanyahu's side at the end of it, being convinced by Ron Dermer, but early on he was trying to bridge the gap. So there was at least more hope with, ironically, and it sounds insane to even say this, but there was more hope with this administration than Biden's. That's how lunatic it was. I saw a Biden senior official and I asked him, what exactly were they doing? He said Blinken would hold meetings with 8 of the top officials on this topic. 7 of them would criticize what he's doing and criticize Israel. Only one would take Israel's side. Blinken would always listen to that one. He said 90% of the State Department were critical of what Blinken was doing. He would always berate them, humiliate them, and say, you don't know how to talk to the Israelis, you don't know how to negotiate. He said that basically whenever Blinken got his own people telling him, Israel is lying to you, Netanyahu's lying to you, he would say, why would Netanyahu lie to me? What's his incentive? And I asked, why did Blinken do that? He said it was basically a combination of deep bias, pure incompetence, and cowardice.
Well, I initially heard rumblings that Witkoff was, somewhat remotely fair-minded, or at least more fair-minded than everybody else working on this. But so far, Witkoff hasn't delivered. In fact, as we discussed, every time there's been a ceasefire on the table, Hamas accepts the terms, Israel goes back and rejects them, and then Witkoff blames Hamas and says Hamas's demands are unacceptable. But he never says what is so unacceptable about Hamas's terms, because it's in fact Israel that is simply just undermining them.
Because the Israelis keep telling him the same talking point, that if you criticize us, Hamas would ask for more. They would become more hardline. It's a very convenient talking point. Civil servants and diplomats kept telling me that these talking points are garbage. They knew it was garbage. They told their ministers, for example, in Germany, they kept telling the minister, Annalena Baerbock, and now the new one, that this is garbage. It doesn't mean anything. and they would never listen. They would hide behind these convenient talking points. One of them, the idea of the looting. The German foreign minister goes to Israel, and the first thing Israelis bring up is, there's a problem of looting in Gaza. That's why we need to cut aid, or that's why we did A and B. And he just folds conveniently behind that talking point to mask his own sort of complicity.
We rarely can find a ray of light in all this, and it is very bleak. But the fact that you mentioned that Rubio is not involved in the process, that to me is a positive, and I think we can end on that somewhat positive note and hope that the ceasefire that's now on the table sticks and becomes permanent, and not just is another Israeli-U.S. attempt to pause mass murder and then resume it. Mohammed Shahada, we really appreciate, as always, you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate all your great work, Aaron and Katie.
That was so great. It's always amazing to talk to Mohammed, who does really wonderful reporting and analysis.
Thank you to Mohammed Shahada once again for joining us, and thanks to you for tuning in. If you want to support the show, keep us going. Our website is usefulidiots.podcast.com. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for listening to and watching Useful Idiots. For extended episodes, bonus content, and our weekly Thursday Throwdown episode, please subscribe at usefulidiots.podcast.com. Support the show for free by subscribing on YouTube, Rumble, and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review. You can also follow us on Twitter at UsefulIdiotPod. Thanks for supporting independent media. We'll see you next time.